The first German machine gun burst split the dawn air at exactly 6 hours and 30 minutes on June 6, 1944, sending Allied soldiers diving face first into the cold sand of Omaha Beach. Lieutenant James Murphy of the 1st Infantry Division felt the bullets whistle past his helmet as he pressed his body against the metal obstacles that Rommel had planted like deadly flowers along the Norman coastline. Behind him, the English Channel churned with the largest armada in human history. Over 5,000 ships stretching to the horizon like a steel forest upon the waves. The morning mist clung to the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, where German artillery positions commanded a deadly view of the beaches below. Murphy could hear the screams of wounded men mixing with the relentless pounding of naval guns from the Allied fleet. The carefully planned Operation Overlord, months in the making, was encountering the brutal reality of German defensive preparations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Atlantic Wall was proving every bit as formidable as the Desert Fox had intended. Captain Heinrich Weber of the 352nd Infantry Division crouched in his concrete bunker, watching through his periscope as thousands of Allied soldiers poured from their landing craft. The sight both terrified and amazed him. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, but never had he witnessed such a massive assault. His machine gun crews were already running low on ammunition, and the morning was barely 2 hours old. Above the beaches, American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, like seeds in a hurricane. Major Richard Winters found himself separated from most of his men, armed with only his rifle and a determination forged in the training camps of Georgia. The pre-dawn drops had gone terribly wrong for many units, with men landing miles from their intended targets in flooded fields and German-held villages. According to historical accounts documented in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the initial assault waves faced casualty rates approaching 50% on some beach sectors, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American forces encountered the veteran 352nd Infantry Division. The sound of naval gunfire created a constant thunder that could be heard 30 miles inland. HMS Warspite, the grand old battleship that had fought at Jutland in the Great War, now turned her 15-inch guns against German positions with methodical precision. Each salvo sent tremors through the Norman earth, shaking loose centuries of dust in village churches where French civilians huddled in prayer. Private Tommy Anderson pressed forward across the killing ground of Omaha Beach, stepping over the bodies of men he had shared breakfast with just hours before. The sand beneath his boots was no longer pale Norman sand, but had turned dark with blood and churned with the debris of war. German mortar rounds continued to fall among the advancing Americans, each explosion sending up geysers of sand, metal, and worse things that Anderson tried not to think about. By noon, the outcome remained uncertain. German reserves were moving toward the beaches, and General Omar Bradley aboard the USS Augusta was considering the unthinkable, evacuating Omaha Beach. The dawn of European liberation hung in the balance as thousands of young men from farms in Kansas and factories in Detroit paid the ultimate price for each yard of French soil. Sergeant John Miller of the 5th Ranger Battalion pressed his back against the scarred cliff face of Pointe du Hoc, feeling the German shells explode overhead in cascades of rock and fire. His mission seemed impossible: scale these 100-foot cliffs under enemy fire and silence the guns that could devastate the landing beaches. The rope ladder beside him swayed in the wind, slick with spray from the channel, and the blood of Rangers who had attempted the climb before him. 3 miles east, British forces of the 3rd Infantry Division were methodically advancing inland from Sword Beach. Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Pine Coffin, whose remarkable name would have seemed fictional in any other context, led his paratroopers through the flooded Caen Canal region. They had successfully captured Pegasus Bridge in the pre-dawn hours, a vital crossing that German counterattacks must not recapture. The sound of panzer tanks rumbling in the distance reminded every man that their hold on Norman soil remained tenuous. Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the German 7th Army, stood in his headquarters at Le Mans, studying reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The Allied deception operation had worked perfectly. He had kept his reserves positioned near the Pas de Calais, expecting the main invasion there. Now his forces were scattered, and the enemy was pouring ashore faster than his scattered units could respond. The Norman hedgerows, those ancient barriers of earth and stone topped with thick brambles, were proving to be unexpected allies to the German defenders. Each field became a fortress, each lane a potential killing ground. American Sherman tanks, superior in numbers, found themselves trapped in the narrow passages while German Panzerfausts turned them into burning coffins for their crews. Private Pierre Dubois of the French resistance crouched in a barn loft outside Carentan, watching German reinforcements march toward the beaches. For 4 years he had waited for this day, enduring the humiliation of occupation, the rationing, the midnight arrests of neighbors who simply disappeared. His Sten gun was loaded with bullets that represented more than mere ammunition. They were invested with the hopes of a nation that had never stopped believing in liberation. Research from the Eisenhower Presidential Library reveals that by the evening of June 6th, Allied forces had established precarious footholds on 5 separate beaches. But the link-up between landing areas remained incomplete, leaving each beachhead vulnerable to concentrated German counterattack. The USS Nevada, veteran of Pearl Harbor, continued her systematic bombardment of German positions throughout the afternoon. Her 9 16-inch guns had been speaking since dawn, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. The old battleship's gunners worked with the precision of clockmakers, adjusting their fire based on calls from shore spotters who crept impossibly close to enemy lines. Captain James Earl Rudder finally reached the top of Pointe du Hoc at 1400 hours, only to discover that the massive German guns his Rangers had sacrificed so much to capture were wooden decoys. The real artillery had been moved inland weeks before, another testament to German defensive cunning. Yet the position still commanded the beaches, and Rudder's men dug in to hold what they had paid for in blood. The German High Command remained confused about Allied intentions well into the afternoon. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was convinced that Normandy was merely a diversion, that the real invasion would still come at Calais. This strategic paralysis meant that crucial panzer reserves remained idle, when they might have driven the Allied forces back into the sea. As darkness fell on the longest day, over 150,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy, but their grip on Hitler's fortress Europe was still fragile. German counterattacks were forming in the gathering dusk, and the real test of Operation Overlord was yet to come. General Bernard Montgomery stood before his map table on June 8, 1944, his sharp eyes tracing the red lines that marked German defensive positions around the ancient Norman city of Caen. The plan had called for the city to fall on D-Day itself, but now, 2 days after the landings, Caen remained firmly in German hands. The medieval spires that had watched over William the Conqueror's birthplace now sheltered some of Germany's finest troops. The 21st Panzer Division had finally arrived at the battlefield, their Tiger tanks moving through the Norman countryside like steel predators. Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, already an ace with over 100 tank kills on the Eastern Front, commanded his Tiger first from the village of Villers-Bocage. His reputation preceded him. Soviet tank crews had learned to flee at the mere sight of his distinctive tank markings. Captain Joe Eakins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry didn't know about Wittmann's reputation as he guided his Sherman Firefly through the narrow streets of Villers-Bocage on June 11th. The British had developed this variant of the American Sherman tank specifically to deal with German armor, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun that could penetrate even Tiger tank armor at reasonable range. Today, that modification would be put to its ultimate test. The morning mist hung heavy over the Normandy hedgerows as British and German armor maneuvered for position. Each field boundary concealed potential death, a Panzerfaust team, an anti-tank gun, or the massive bulk of a Tiger tank waiting in ambush. The Bocage country that had seemed so picturesque in peacetime photographs now became a labyrinth of potential killing grounds. Wittmann's Tiger emerged from concealment like a prehistoric monster, its 88mm gun already trained on the lead British tanks. The first shot destroyed a Sherman with clinical precision, the armor-piercing round punching through steel plate as if it were paper. The second and third shots followed with mechanical regularity, turning the British column into a funeral pyre of burning tanks and dying men. Historical records from the Tank Museum in Bovington document that Wittmann's single Tiger tank destroyed 25 British vehicles in the space of 15 minutes during the Battle of Villers-Bocage, representing one of the most devastating individual performances in armored warfare history. But Captain Eakins had positioned his Firefly in a hull-down position behind a stone wall, invisible to German observation. As Wittmann's Tiger moved past his hiding place, Eakins traversed his turret with the patience of a hunter. The 17-pounder gun spoke once, its tungsten-cored round striking the Tiger's side armor at an angle that defeated even German engineering. The destruction of Michael Wittmann became a symbol for British forces, proof that German supermen were mortal after all. Yet the tactical situation around Caen remained critical. German forces under General Sepp Dietrich had established defensive positions that exploited every advantage of the terrain. The 1st SS Panzer Corps included some of the most fanatical troops in the German army, men who had learned their trade in the cauldrons of Russia. French civilians caught between the opposing armies faced impossible choices. Madame Marie Leclerc watched from her cellar window as British tanks rumbled past her farmhouse, followed minutes later by German panzers. Her small stone house, built by her grandfather after the Franco-Prussian War, now sat directly on the line of battle between two mechanized armies. The Royal Air Force maintained constant pressure on German positions, but close air support in the Bocage country proved nearly impossible. Hawker Typhoons armed with rockets could devastate German armor in open country, but the hedge-lined fields of Normandy provided too much concealment. Friendly fire incidents became tragically common as pilots struggled to distinguish between Allied and German vehicles in the maze of fields below. By June 15th, the Battle of Caen had evolved into a grinding attritional struggle that neither side could easily win. Montgomery's forces controlled the northern approaches to the city, but German defenders had turned every building into a fortress. The liberation of Europe would require patience, sacrifice, and tactics that no military academy had ever taught. Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment pressed his binoculars to his eyes, studying the German positions that crowned Hill 117 outside St. Lo. The Norman town, already reduced to rubble by weeks of fighting, commanded the crucial road junction that American forces needed to break out of their confined beachhead. Every street corner had become a fortress, every cellar a machine gun nest. The hedgerow fighting had claimed thousands of casualties on both sides. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division had revolutionized American tactics with his simple innovation, welding steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks. These Rhino tanks could now punch through the ancient Norman hedgerows instead of climbing over them like helpless beetles, exposing their vulnerable belly armor to German Panzerfausts. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, arguably the finest armored formation in the German army. His men were veterans of North Africa and Russia, survivors who had learned their deadly trade in the harshest schools of war. From his command post in a Norman farmhouse, Bayerlein watched American forces probe his defensive lines with growing respect for their adaptability and determination. The air above St. Lo thundered constantly with Allied aircraft. Operation Cobra, the planned American breakthrough, would begin with the most concentrated bombing attack in military history. Over 2,000 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force would carpet the German positions with high explosives, theoretically creating a gap through which American armor could pour toward Paris. Private Bobby Thompson of the 4th Infantry Division crouched in a shell crater, sharing his last cigarette with a replacement who looked young enough to be in high school. The kid's hands shook as he tried to light the cigarette. Whether from fear or exhaustion, Thompson couldn't tell. They all shook now. The ones who had been fighting since D-Day had earned the right to tremble. On July 24th, 1944, the bombers came. The sky darkened with their formations, flying fortresses and liberators stretching from horizon to horizon like a mechanical thunderstorm. The sound of their engines merged into a continuous roar that drowned out artillery fire and made conversation impossible. German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front described it as worse than anything they had experienced in Russia. Documentation from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey indicates that Operation Cobra dropped over 4,000 tons of high explosives on German positions in a rectangular area measuring approximately 7 miles by 2 miles, representing the most concentrated bombing attack of the Second World War. The bombing was devastating but imprecise. Several bombs fell short, landing among American forward positions and killing Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. The tragedy illustrated the deadly mathematics of modern warfare. Even friendly forces could become casualties in the pursuit of victory. General Lieutenant Bayerlein later described the aftermath. His Panzer Lehr division had virtually ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Tanks had been flipped upside down by bomb blasts, men had been buried alive in their bunkers, and radio communications had been completely severed. The survivors wandered through a moonscape of craters and twisted metal, their elaborate defensive positions reduced to nothing more than memories and smoke. Yet American ground forces initially failed to exploit the breakthrough. The Bocage country channeled their advance into predictable corridors, and scattered German resistance proved surprisingly effective. Small groups of Wehrmacht soldiers with a single anti-tank gun could halt entire tank columns for hours, buying time for German reserves to move into blocking positions. The real breakthrough came when American commanders abandoned their cautious approach and committed their armor reserves in a bold gamble. The 3rd Armored Division, commanded by the aggressive General Maurice Rose, punched through the German lines like a steel fist. Behind them, General George Patton's Third Army was preparing to enter the battle, though Patton himself remained officially non-existent according to Allied deception plans. By July 28th, American forces had advanced over 20 miles beyond St. Lo, farther than they had moved in the previous 7 weeks combined. The static battle of the hedgerows was finally giving way to mobile warfare, and the German army in Normandy faced the prospect of complete encirclement. General George Smith Patton Jr. finally emerged from the shadows on August 1st, 1944, taking command of the newly activated Third Army with characteristic theatrical flair. For months, the Germans had believed he was commanding a phantom army group in southeastern England, part of the Allied deception that kept German reserves pinned down near Calais. Now the most aggressive American commander of the war was loose in the Norman countryside with 4 armored divisions and a mandate to exploit the St. Lo breakthrough. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge faced an impossible situation from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. Hitler had ordered him to counterattack toward Avranches, cutting off the American spearheads and driving them back to the sea. The plan, Operation Lüttich, required concentrating Germany's remaining armored reserves for a desperate gamble that von Kluge knew had little chance of success. Yet failure to obey the Führer's orders would mean disgrace, court-martial, and probable execution. The German attack began before dawn on August 7th, spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. Panthers and Tigers rolled through the morning mist toward Mortagne, their objective the vital town of Avranches that controlled American supply routes. For a few hours, it seemed possible that German audacity might succeed where caution had failed. Major General Ernest Harman's 2nd Armored Division met the German thrust head-on in the rolling hills around Mortagne. Tank fought tank at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, their guns speaking with deadly precision across Norman meadows that had known only peace since William the Conqueror's time. The battle swayed back and forth as reinforcements arrived on both sides, turning peaceful villages into killing grounds littered with burning vehicles. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole commanded an M4 Sherman named In the Mood, and had become something of a legend among American tank crews. His gunner could put a 75mm shell through a window at 800 yards, and Poole had the tactical instinct to place his tank where it could do the most damage to German armor. On this morning near Mortagne, that instinct would be tested against some of Germany's finest panzer crews. The Luftwaffe made its final significant appearance over Normandy during Operation Lüttich, launching nearly 300 sorties in support of the German ground attack. Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Focke-Wulf 190 ground attack aircraft swept in at treetop level. their black crosses clearly visible to Allied soldiers who had grown accustomed to complete air superiority. Archives from the Royal Air Force Museum document that Allied fighter bombers flew over 3,000 sorties on August 7, 1944, effectively ending German offensive capability in Normandy and marking the last major Luftwaffe operation on the Western Front. But the German attack had delayed Allied progress just long enough for a more dangerous situation to develop. While Patton's armor raced eastward toward Paris, British and Canadian forces finally captured Caen and began their own drive southward. The two Allied spearheads were converging on the small town of Falaise, threatening to trap the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a pocket with no escape route. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, could read a map as well as any professional soldier. His forces were being squeezed into an ever-shrinking cauldron, hammered day and night by Allied aircraft and artillery. Every hour that passed made escape less likely and surrender more inevitable. Yet German discipline held, and his men continued fighting with the desperate courage of trapped wolves. The roads leading east from Falaise became scenes of unprecedented carnage as German units attempted to escape the closing trap. Allied fighter bombers descended on the fleeing columns like birds of prey, their rockets and machine guns turning highways into graveyards. Horses and vehicles, soldiers and civilians, military equipment and personal possessions, all became tangled together in what Allied pilots grimly dubbed the Falaise Death Valley. French civilians found themselves caught in the center of the maelstrom. The Dumont family had hidden in their farmhouse cellar for weeks, emerging only to find water or tend their wounded neighbors. Now German soldiers were digging foxholes in their wheat field, while American artillery shells fell like deadly rain from a cloudless summer sky. By August 15th, the Falaise pocket had shrunk to a few square miles around the town of Chambois. Over 200,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the shrinking perimeter, their ammunition running low, their medical supplies exhausted, their hope fading with each passing hour. The once mighty Wehrmacht was being systematically destroyed in the Norman countryside. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment positioned his Sherman tank at the crossroads of Chambois, watching German columns streaming eastward in desperate attempts to escape the tightening noose. The Canadian forces had linked up with elements of the Polish 1st Armored Division, officially closing the Falaise pocket, but the gap remained porous. Thousands of German soldiers were still slipping through Allied lines under cover of darkness. General Oberst Paul Hauser, commanding the German 7th Army, had been wounded by Allied strafing attacks but refused evacuation. From his mobile command post, nothing more than a few vehicles hidden in a Norman wood, he coordinated the breakout attempts of his scattered forces. Professional soldiers to the end, German officers maintained discipline even as their army disintegrated around them. The Polish 1st Armored Division had fought with particular distinction during the closing of the pocket. General Stanisław Maciek's men carried personal reasons for their hatred of German forces, memories of September 1939 when their homeland had been crushed between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Now, 5 years later, Polish tanks were helping to destroy Wehrmacht formations in the fields of France. Allied artillery concentrations reached unprecedented intensity as German breakout attempts grew more desperate. The countryside around Chambois shook continuously under the impact of shells from British 25-pounders, American 105mm howitzers, and Canadian field guns. German soldiers described the barrage as resembling an earthquake that never stopped, a continuous trembling of the earth that made sleep impossible and rational thought difficult. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded the remnants of the 21st Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, leading one of the last organized German units still fighting inside the pocket. His men moved only at night, hiding their vehicles under hay in Norman barns during daylight hours, when Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Von Luck had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, and Russia, but never had he felt so isolated and hopeless. The humanitarian crisis inside the Falaise pocket defied description. German medical personnel worked without adequate supplies to treat thousands of wounded soldiers, while French civilians caught in the battle zone struggled to survive in cellars and ruins. Water sources had been contaminated by decomposing corpses, and the August heat made conditions almost unbearable for combatants and non-combatants alike. Records maintained by the International Committee of the Red Cross reveal that over 40,000 German military personnel required medical treatment following the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, with civilian casualties estimated at several thousand additional victims of the intensive fighting. Captain Jacques Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division had raced north from the American breakout sector, desperate to participate in the liberation of French soil. His men fought with the passion of soldiers defending their homeland, even though many had not seen France for 4 years of exile. The tricolor flag flew from French tanks as they closed the final escape routes from the German pocket. The final German breakout attempt began at midnight on August 19, 1944. General Hauser personally led the assault, his staff officers and headquarters troops fighting as infantry in a last desperate gamble to escape the trap. German paratroopers, SS Panzer Grenadiers, and Wehrmacht regulars advanced together across moonlit fields, their different uniforms and unit traditions forgotten in the common struggle for survival. Allied forces were ready. Major Currie's Canadians had registered their guns on every likely escape route, while Polish armor waited in hull-down positions to engage any German vehicles that broke through the initial defensive line. When German flares illuminated the battlefield, they revealed a scene from Dante's imagination. Thousands of men stumbling forward through smoke and shell bursts, many wounded, all desperate. The battle raged until dawn. Small unit actions fought with rifle and grenade in Norman hedgerows that would never again know peace. When the sun rose on August 20th, the Falaise Pocket had finally been sealed. Over 50,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner, while an estimated 10,000 had been killed in the fighting. The German Army Group B had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of the Western Front, replacing the discredited von Klug, who would die by his own hand rather than face Hitler's wrath. Model was Germany's finest defensive specialist, the man who had stabilized the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. If anyone could salvage something from the Normandy disaster, it would be the officer his soldiers called the Führer's fireman. General Charles de Gaulle stood in the back of an open car, his towering frame unmistakable as he drove down the Champs-Élysées on August 26, 1944. 2 million Parisians lined the avenue, cheering the man who had never stopped believing in France's eventual liberation. Behind him, tanks of the French 2nd Armored Division rolled toward the Arc de Triomphe, their crews weeping openly as they fulfilled dreams that had sustained them through 4 years of exile. The liberation of Paris had come faster than anyone expected. General Dietrich von Koltitz, the German military governor, had received explicit orders from Hitler to destroy the city rather than surrender it intact. Bridges were to be blown, monuments demolished, and the City of Light reduced to rubble. Yet von Koltitz could not bring himself to destroy the most beautiful city in Europe, and his disobedience would save Paris for posterity. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower faced impossible choices as August drew to a close. His armies had advanced farther and faster than the most optimistic pre-invasion planning had projected, but supply lines stretched back to the Normandy beaches were reaching their breaking point. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every K-ration had to travel hundreds of miles from the landing beaches through war-torn French countryside. The German retreat from Normandy had become a rout of unprecedented proportions. Entire divisions had been reduced to regimental strength, while others existed only on paper in staff reports filed from Berlin. Model's attempts to establish defensive lines along the Seine River had failed when Allied armored spearheads crossed the river, before German engineers could destroy the bridges. Captain Ernst von Bressendorf commanded the rear guard of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, tasked with delaying American pursuit while the remnants of Army Group B escaped eastward. His men were mostly teenagers now, boys from Bavaria and Prussia who had volunteered for the SS in the optimistic early days of the war. They fought with desperate courage, but courage alone could not compensate for overwhelming Allied superiority in men and material. French civilians emerged from cellars and hiding places to greet their liberators with wine, that had been hidden since 1940, bread baked from hoarded flour, and flowers picked from gardens that had grown wild during the occupation years. In village after village, American and British soldiers found themselves embraced by crowds who had waited 4 long years for this moment of freedom. The Norman countryside bore scars that would last for decades. Caen lay in ruins, its medieval cathedral damaged by bombs and shells. The hedgerow country was littered with burned-out tanks and abandoned equipment, while cemeteries filled with temporary wooden crosses marked the final resting places of young men who would never see their homes again. Lieutenant Murphy, who had survived the hell of Omaha Beach, now commanded a company of infantry advancing toward the German border. His original platoon was gone, some dead, some wounded, some transferred to other units during the long campaign. The Green Lieutenant who had landed in Normandy had been replaced by a hard-eyed veteran who understood the true cost of victory. Intelligence reports reaching Allied headquarters confirmed that German resistance in the West was approaching complete collapse. Model's armies were retreating toward the Rhine River as fast as their remaining vehicles could carry them, abandoning France to the Allied pursuit. The great gamble of Operation Overlord had succeeded beyond Churchill's wildest expectations, yet victory in Normandy was only the beginning of a longer journey. The German heartland still lay ahead, defended by armies that would fight with the desperation of men protecting their homeland. Hitler's regime showed no signs of surrender despite the military catastrophe, and reports from the Eastern Front suggested that Soviet forces were preparing their own massive offensive toward Berlin. As September dawned over the liberated territories, Allied commanders paused to count the cost of their triumph. The Battle of Normandy had claimed over 200,000 Allied casualties, while German losses exceeded 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. An entire German army group had been destroyed, but the war was far from over. The dawn of a new European future had indeed broken over the Norman beaches, but that dawn would reveal landscapes scarred by modern warfare and populations exhausted by years of suffering. The liberation of Western Europe was complete, yet the final victory over Nazi Germany would require many more months of bitter fighting before the last shot was fired in the ruins of Berlin. The boys who had stormed Hitler's Atlantic Wall had become men in the crucible of battle, and they would need all their hard-won experience for the challenges that lay ahead on the road to final victory, rather than face Hitler's wrath. Model was Germany's finest defensive specialist, the man who had stabilized the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. If anyone could salvage something from the Normandy disaster, it would be the officer his soldiers called the Führer's fireman.